I'm Dean Safola, and this is the Azure Academy. So, when we last left off, we were working with our Azure portal, creating some resources. So, this is the Create Resource button, and like we looked at in our documentation and in our last video when we looked at all of our services, the new button brings us to the Azure Marketplace where you can deploy any kind of resource that's in Azure. That could be stuff from Microsoft or from third-party vendors, for example, Citrix. And you can see here's all of the things that Citrix provides, quite a lot. And then what if we did SUSE? So a whole lot provided by SUSE. Or maybe we want to look at a type of something. So here's a type of resource, a firewall. So you can see we've got some Barracudas, and we've got Impervas and Fortinets, and sure Cisco's in here somewhere. The point being that every type of resource is something that you can do a search for here, not just servers. So you can even see we have virtual networks, availability set, Ubuntu servers, web apps, WordPress, which is a website, Azure Web Apps, Jenkins, and etc. So a whole lot of stuff that's here. And there's subcategories over on this side, even Internet of Things based stuff, which would use IoT Hub in Azure, Event Hub, Service Bus, HD Insights, identity related items, Intune, Azure Active Directory, Checkpoint VPNs, other management tools, and you can see that there's just a whole lot of stuff here. But to get started, the very first thing that everything must have is a resource group. So what is a resource group? A resource group in Azure is a container for metadata. So the resource group is where every resource must live in a resource group somewhere. And that resource group has a location. The location does not have to be the location of your resources. So you could have a resource group in Japan, but your resources in US. So it's just a metadata container so that we know that these resources have some kind of relationship to each other. Now that relationship can be defined by you. It is either that they're part of the same application, the same deployment, the same department, the same type of resource. However, that structure is going to work best for you to manage your environment in the cloud. And when you go to create a resource group, you have to give it a name, it has to be in a subscription, and it has to have a location. So let's take a second and talk through each of these. So a name seems rather obvious, but with names, there are certain character limitations based on each kind of resource that you would have to satisfy. For example, one thing that generally we don't allow is my resource group, and then tab out of it, and you see we have a problem. And it'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that I have spaces, and we don't allow spaces. So you would have to change that to either be a dash, or you could use underscores or something like that to have in your name, or have no spaces at all. So we'll say Azure Academy. Okay, and now we have a subscription. So what is a subscription? Well, I've mentioned this a few times already. A subscription is a boundary in Azure. It's a boundary usually based on billing, and it is where all of your resources that you build in Azure are tied back to. It is not Azure Active Directory. That's something separate. That's called a tenant. We'll cover that later. But a subscription is where all of your resources live. It's where all of your billing gets done, all of your tagging lives, all of your constructs that you build, all your resources in your resource groups, everything is tied to your subscription. Okay, so in some circumstances, a resource can cross subscriptions. So I could have a resource in subscription 1 that's used by subscription 2. And as long as I have access and permissions in both subscriptions, I can do that for some kinds of resources. An example would be VNet peering. So if I have a virtual network in subscription 1 and another virtual network in subscription 2, I can peer the two of them together if I have rights in both of them. Okay, and we'll cover more things like that later. So then we have locations. Now, a location, this is those 52 regions that we talked about. These are the regions that are available to deploy this particular kind of resource. And in our documentation, there is an entire table that shows every kind of resource and every region where that resource can be deployed. Okay, now you notice though that there are not 52 in this list. So what's up with that? Well, that's because this is Azure Public Cloud, and then there is another side of Azure that's used in isolated regions, which sometimes is called GovCloud, where we isolate those things so that the public cloud does not have general access to them so that they can be more secure. Other differences between the sovereign clouds, gov clouds, whatever you would want to call it, is that they are generally more highly regulated and require more certifications before a product can be released into those environments. So based on that, those clouds are generally behind what the public cloud is offering. Okay, so it's not that there's anything wrong with them. They're great, and you can use them if you're in one of those regions. Like I think Germany has its own sovereign cloud. I think China does, and the US government has a bunch of the sovereign cloud regions. And I can't see those from here because this is just a public subscription. So I'm going to pick the subscription that is either near me or related to where my application is or nearest to where my users are, but it's got to go somewhere. So in my case, I'm going to put it in East US, and then I'm going to hit create. Okay, and really quick, we have a new resource group created, and then we can go to our resource right from our notification, and there it is. And so you can see our resource group is empty. But on our side here, now we have something kind of different. It's not like the panel that we had over here with our favorites. This is something different. This is called a blade. And this blade is going to show up repeatedly. So we'll have a blade, for example, if I look at all of my resource groups, and then I click on my Azure Academy resource group, now you can see the window looks a little bit different. So that's the difference between getting to a resource directly. You eliminate this first blade and just have this second one, or I can even minimize it. So in the blade, there's a lot of items here. As you can see, they're fairly standard, but it's also somewhat based on the resource type. At the top, we have the overview, the activity log, which shows you everything that's happened, the access control, who has permissions into this kind of resource, any kind of tags that exist, and events that happen. And then we have a quick start, and this is in all of our resources so that you can learn a little more about what this resource is and what it does. Resource cost, which is tied to all of your billing for your resources. Deployments, which when you build new resources in your resource group, you'll have a deployment for each of those. Policies, which are how things are governed within this resource group. The properties, which we'll take a look at quickly. And this is the same kind of information that we had when we created it, the name, the location, and then the subscription. So this is my subscription ID. And what these begin to show you here is something that's going to come back in a lot of our automation is this is my ID. So every resource in Azure has an ID, and that ID always starts with the subscription and the subscription ID, and then what the resource is. So normally there'll be something like resource groups, that is a provider in Azure, and then the name of that resource. Okay, so we'll come back and talk more about that later. So then we have also locks. Locks, there are two kinds in Azure, and the one is a change lock and the other is a delete lock. So a change lock means that nobody can alter this resource. Nobody. Doesn't matter if you're the owner of the subscription, the owner of the resource. Once a lock is in place, nobody can change it. You would have to take the lock off, make your change, and put the lock back on. And the other one is a delete lock, which does the same thing. Nobody can delete this resource at all. If you want it deleted, then you have to take the lock off. So this is really handy in production environments. You can build out your production, get everything exactly the way you want it, put a change lock on, put a delete lock on, and then you know nobody is going to alter this. Okay. Then we have an automation script, which we'll take a look at briefly, but we'll come back to because there's not really much here right now. So this is the framework for a Azure template. And an Azure template is one way that you can deploy resources. Other ways are up here. You have CLI, which is the Azure Bash shell, and then you have the PowerShell, and then you can also do this with .NET and with Ruby. And so a template is going to be a lot of automation work that we'll do in the future, and we list all of our resources that we want, input parameters, variables, and you can have many other things here and basically build an entire solution from a single template. Okay, and then we also have some monitoring aspects, and here we have metrics, and there won't be anything really here right now because I just built this. And then we have some things that are labeled as classic, and you'll see this over time. Things that are today don't have classic next to them will have that in the future, and that's as we improve the product and we keep making additions and changes. Then we have application insights, which again, there won't be anything here at this point because I don't have any. And then we have log analytics, which I have some things created that are related to other deployments, but nothing for this resource group. And then you can do some log searches, and then there are advisor recommendations. So a recommendation is things that we see as Azure running this hyper global scale, and some best practices that we see, things that would help you to run your environment better, things that would secure your environment better, and nothing is showing up here currently because I don't have any resources. And then we have our new support requests, and that's where you can go in and start a support request for any kind of issue that you have related to your Azure subscription, which I'll go back right now because we don't have any issues with that. So here we are back at the overview. So that's it for resource group basics, and in our next video we'll start creating some resources beginning with a virtual network.